thanks, Carl, and thanks to all of you for coming out on a nice sunny afternoon. It's great to be back in Austin after all these years. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces and meet new faces as well. So today I'm not going to talk a whole lot about computers and language teaching directly. What I'd like to do is sort of back up and take a look at issues, relationships between language and technology that go back millennia, and try to make sense of what's happening now in the age of computers. And get some perspective on where we are today and where we need to be to prepare our students for the future. So the basic thing I want to do is take the words literacy, technology, and language learning and broaden our notions of these three terms. Broaden our notion of technology, so we see that if we don't use computers, we're still using technology in many aspects of our teaching. Broaden our notion of literacy besides just inscribing and decoding words and dealing with thinking and interaction with people and so forth. And also broaden our focus on language teaching beyond words and structures to a wide variety of ways of making meaning through various resources, language being an important one. So just to start with technology, I mean, we often think of technology as being sort of an add-on to language teaching, but that's only because we think of technology so often in terms of language labs and computers. But the perspective I'd like to take today is an historical one. And if you look at it from an historical perspective, technology has really been at the heart of language teaching as long as languages have been taught. Technology really goes back to the origins of writing over 5,000 years ago. When writing was invented, this was a way of making visible and thereby analyzable all the phenomena that is associated with language, to analyze it as a system, to develop metalinguistic notions of words and sentences and rules, all the kinds of things that we teach. None of this would be possible without the technology of writing. Then print technology in the 15th century allowed for the widespread dissemination of texts. Dictionaries, grammars, textbooks, and this, print technology remains the single technology that's had the greatest impact on language teaching and education more broadly to date. Then in the 19th century, we had sound recording technologies, which allowed us to capture voice along with all the intonational and stress features. And this allowed us to delay listening and to listen to a given stretch of speech as many times as we wanted, rather than just having one shot to catch something that was spoken. Also allowed us to analyze speech as text. So with each of these technologies, you can see how we're building an increasingly complex panoply of resources. Film technology in the late 19th century brought motion and animation, which led Thomas Edison to predict in 1913 that books would be made obsolete in the schools in a matter of a decade or two. Well, that didn't quite work out, but films are still an important part of the educational process. So in the last 40 years, computers have brought together all of these threads, going back, with writing, sound recording, film, animation, and so forth, combining all of these, and has hurtled us into the virtual and multimedia age that allows us to integrate graphic design, images, color, sound, all with writing and speech to give us a very rich palette to work from in our language courses. Meanwhile, computers have changed the nature of texts, which have now become malleable, dynamic, and even ephemeral. So this forces us to sort of rethink our notions of what writing and literacy are. And computers have also introduced new contexts and purposes for writing. These new contexts and purposes have introduced new language forms and discourse structures, and that's some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Also with computers, we have new notions of authorship and publication. This is a hot issue right now with journals as to whether things are going to be open source or still controlled by publishing houses. And also computers give us a whole new way of relating to one another, both within our local community and in international communities. The internet has allowed us not only to write to one another, but now to see one another, to talk directly to one another halfway around the world. So the questions that I want to ask today are, how do all these changes that I've talked about affect the ways we use language and the ways we learn language? And secondly, how do these changes affect what we mean by literacy and how we might best approach teaching it? So those are the questions you should keep in the back of your mind. So as you all know, language is changing around us all the time. I mean, if just 10 years ago, a very short time ago, I said I Googled it, posted it on my blog, and then IM'd my friends, this would not be comprehensible. It's amazing. I mean, we take all these things for granted now, but just 10 years ago, these things didn't exist. But the point I'd like to make is this is really sort of vocabulary, and this is just new vocabulary that's come up, new techniques, but that there are other changes that I think are more profound than these specific techniques and vocabulary issues. Not revolutionary changes, but changes that are tied to age-old issues that always seem to crop up when you're dealing with technology and language together. So what I thought we'd do is start off with taking sort of a galloping view of the past, and we'll go back to Mesopotamia. The point I want to make is that reading and writing are not just cognitive processes, but tied to social and culturally embedded activities. And so what you've got here is a Mesopotamian clay tablet. Now this looks monolithic, but it's actually very small. It fits in the palm of your hand. And this is a prayer to the warrior god Ninurta. And this dates to 2000 BC. And what's interesting about this is that the prayer is encoded, but as many of the symbols that contain content, the number is matched by symbols that have to do with the performance aspect, the tone of voice that should be used when this prayer is intoned by the performer. So writing is really as much about tone of voice as it is about content. If we look to scrolls, here we have a book roll or scroll on the left. I mean, this was the form of literary works for at least 700 years in ancient Greece and Rome. The Library of Alexandria was filled with scrolls, not folded codices. Now, what's interesting when you look at these book rolls or scroll documents, typically the ones that have lasted are the ones that have been found, the Greek scrolls that have been found in Egypt, because the ones north of the Mediterranean were all sort of dissolved by the humidity, but the ones that were in the desert of Egypt have been preserved. And it's really interesting to look at these papyri to see that there were no spaces in between words, no punctuation. I'm going to flip forward just a second here to, this is a papyrus text. You can see these uniform columns with no spaces between words. The idea is that these texts were performed by specialized lectors. Literacy was not democratized. The idea wasn't that everyone should be literate. There were specialized lectors that knew how to read these texts. And William Johnson, who's a classicist at Cincinnati, he did a book called the Book Rolls of Oxyrhynchus. These were book rolls that were discovered in Egypt at the Oxyrhynchus site. And it's really interesting to get his perspective on this, because he's done a study of the dimensions of these columns and so forth. And the idea is that this would be a scroll that would go on very far in both horizontally and both on this side and on that side, and this would be the top and the bottom. So we're not seeing the full extent of the roll laid out. We're just seeing a truncated part that would fit on the screen. But In his study, he looks at the fact that there are 15 to 25 letters in these columns wide, and this is just the amount that reading research has shown is what we take in ahead of our eyes when we're reading, so that the lector can be reading this aloud, but then taking this in with his eyes as he's speaking. And the idea was that spaces just got in the way and made these lines wider. So the idea is you can, by keeping it narrow, you can keep it to the foveal arc, and it keeps it optimal. What's interesting is the Romans, when they first developed their first literary text, they did have spaces between words, but these only lasted, the spaces between words only lasted about a century, and they went back to having no spaces between words. So there was obviously it served a purpose not having spaces between words. And it's very hard for us to relate to in this day and age about why on earth you would want to not have spaces between words. Why wouldn't you have punctuation? Why wouldn't you have section headings? All these kinds of navigational aids. Well, the idea is that we live in a very different literacy culture, a different reading culture than the ancients did. With their literary texts, the idea is you'd have a group of elite people sitting around eating grapes, and you'd have a lector who would speak the text for the enjoyment, the aesthetic appreciation of those gathered. It wasn't a question of going to the text and looking something up, saying, I want to find out where so-and-so says something about X. And then you've got this scroll, and how are you going to lay it out across the whole floor of the auditorium and then try and search for it? That wasn't part of the reading culture. So they didn't have need for the kinds of things that we have today with the elaborate navigation aids that we have. So they weren't used as reference. Now, when we go to a modern website like the UT, whoops, I want to go back to this. As soon as we go to any heading here, all of a sudden a bunch of now subheadings pop out, and we've got, this can be configured for prospective students, current students, faculty. So no matter what your purpose is, there's a whole sort of sub-system that awaits you that will help you navigate through this ocean of information. And so you have a very quick and easy way of getting at it. But for the Greeks and Romans, this was not so much an issue. Also, the wax tablet here, and this is the way that kids learned how to read and write for centuries, well into the medieval time, Renaissance times even. And the idea was this is sort of like the early word processor, because you can write on the tablet and then rub it out and you can start all over again. So you have erasable text. What's interesting is that the text often constrained the product that came out of it. And Quintilian tells this story about how a student of his kept writing these long speeches that everyone complained about because they were too long. And so the cure, and he was writing on this tablet that was more wide than tall. And so Quintilian said, this is what we need to do. We need to give him a narrow, because he was counting up his lines. He was saying, I'm within the line limit, okay? But they gave him this narrow, they said, okay, use this wax tablet. And then this was a narrow wax tablet. And that was the cure for this student, because now his speeches were within an acceptable, they were much more interesting and pithy, and he didn't go on and on and on because he had less space. When he counted up the lines, it was now within space. So even as we'll see later on, the spatial dimensions of the writing instrument play an important role. Okay, as we saw here, we've got all kinds of hot links, search buttons, frames, and so forth that would have been irrelevant to the ancients. Now, when we go to the Codex, where the pages were not rolled but now folded, and this was a pagan invention, folding the pages, but it was quickly adopted by the early Christians that were persecuted, for their belief. And so the idea was that they could fold up a document and hide it in their clothing, and it wouldn't go noticed because it was flat. And also it allowed them to access, like Paul's epistles or something where it was a series, you could then quickly access one versus another. So you didn't have to roll out something and find out. You could quickly access. So it's very practical. And when when codices began to be produced in manuscript form, you gradually began to have spaces between words. And a number of scholars have associated the presence of spaces between words with silent reading, because reading was always spoken out loud, and then the idea was that now, by separating words, it makes possible silent reading. That's a very controversial debate, and there are people, I don't want to get into that right now, but William Johnson, for example, argues strongly that there's lots of evidence that people were certainly able to read silently in the days of non-separated works, but there just wasn't part of the culture to do that. This is an interesting, this Castilian Torah shows the sociocultural dimensions of texts. And the idea is you've got an infinite loop of writing around the end, and then within each of these verses, it's a loop, so it goes around and around. When you get to the end, you're back at the beginning. And the idea is not only do you have this notion of the infinite, but this was placed on a table, and you'd have people on all sides of the table reading. And that means that no matter what your perspective is, you can still participate in the reading because this is going around the four sides. So it's very much tied into the culture of reading. The text is reflecting the ways in which written text is used. So the ways we read and write are tied very much to the social and cultural contexts as much as they are to technology. And then also, the forms of writing reflect the social and cultural needs of their users, and they change as these needs change. So the bottom line is, when we're looking at technologies of writing, we also have to look at the reading cultures that surround and co-evolve with them. So let's take a look at some precursors to things that we associate with computers. These are early hypertexts. The first, Janet will be interested in this one, and Katie, this is a German text. You may already know this about this text, but it's the Chronicle of World History from Creation to 1595. It's a 16th century German book with no beginning, middle, or end. I mean, these are all just strips of leather with writing on them. So you can pick any point to begin with, and then read as much as you want, and then leave it, and then pick up again somewhere. There's no relationship. You just make your own connections as you go through. So there's no linear chronology. And then this one on the right, this is Raymond Queneau's reading, what he called his reading machine, machine à lecture. And the idea was you have, this is a poem, and the idea is, it's actually, what he called it was the 100,000 milliards de poèmes. So this is 100,000 billion poems, because the idea is all the permutations that you can have. He worked it out so that that it would always rhyme and would always make sense. So whatever order you laid these strips down in, you would have a well-formed verse. But the downside is that any human individual would never in a lifetime be able to read all of the possible poems. So, but that way generations could read and never exhaust the possibilities. Now, one of the things that happens with every medium along the way is there a remediation. So now you have computer websites that have put Queneau's reading machine on computer. So what you do here is you click on new poem, and it just rearranges the verses, and you get a new poem. There's another website where you have a little bit more involvement in that you get to pick. Now they were only able to, for each line of verse, they were only able to use 4 because of it's still has a copyright, and so they couldn't use all 10 of them. But the idea is you can pick, one, change this here and there, and then you've got a new verse. And some of them allow you then to print up the poem formatted nicely and so forth. But this is, sort of now taking the computer version of Queneau's project. So the idea is that some of these ideas that we take as revolutionarily new actually go back centuries. But by the same token, some of the new technologies are remediating things. So another example of remediation is with, actually this is the Gutenberg Bible. This is from the Harry Ransom Center, their copy of the Gutenberg Bible. And the Gutenberg Press, the early printed books were remediations of manuscripts because you see the illuminations and so forth. The idea is to make it as much like a manuscript as possible, but better in that it can be mass produced, or at least produced on a wider scale. And then you've got examples like this, where you've got a book that appears on the screen, but with a scroll bar, so that you can scroll within the book interface. So all these things are kinds of ways of making it relatable. You can relate to it because it's a familiar and yet new context all at the same time. One of the things you find with a lot of news websites, this is Libération, but it's CNN has got a similar thing, is that they will have a kind of like a ticker tape section. Oh, we'll see if this comes up or not. I'm not sure. Yeah, here we go. This section right in here, you see the news scrolling by. This is like the old 1920s ticker tape machines that would come out of that sort of glass bubble, and they would announce the news as it was appearing. It creates a great sense of immediacy of things happening right here, right now, and you're getting it straight from. But what's interesting is that it's never the main stories. In this context, it's always sort of subsidiary stories. So it still gives you that sense of immediacy, but it's not presenting the main text, which is always over more to the left. So it has its own particular purpose. This is an interesting one. Le Monde has got this feature where you can get your electronic, you can read the paper online like this, but you can get the electronic version. Yeah, here we go. So look what happens when we click on this. We have now the Journal électronique, and this puts it back in paper reading mode. It's downloading right now, and with this tool, we get to flip through the paper just like we would read the paper version. This may take too long. I may have to skip this, but it's almost done. Okay. See, I'm a prisoner to the technology. I see that scroll bar going across, and I think it's almost there. Okay. But it's not. That's the problem. Okay. All right. Anyway, the idea is you click on this, and what happens is you see a digital thing where the page folds over and flips over to the other side, and you even have a little rustling sound so that you've got, the idea that, yes, it is familiar, even though it's on screen. You are turning a page, and it's creating all the sounds and familiar, everything but the feel, of the paper. Okay. So one thing that's not new, of course, is the combination of image and text. Illuminated manuscripts and medieval churches with their stained glass windows telling stories of the gospel, and rebus books have always been very popular. Science books illustrated with drawings, and newspapers and magazines using graphics in combination with text. This is nothing new about all that. But there are some aspects that do go beyond what we've known before, and I'll come to that in just a few minutes. But meanwhile, what does all this tell us about literacy? Well, first of all, it means that literacy is not just a question of putting words on paper and decoding them, or just a set of academic skills, that it's really about cultures of reading, cultures of writing, and looking at reading and writing in their variable social contexts of use. So it's involving thinking, it's involving talking, ways of interacting with other people, and so forth. So literacy changes according to social context. So Shirley Bryce Heath's research in South Carolina, where she was looking at adolescents in 3 communities, was actually 3 different brands of literacy. Wagner's research in Morocco, looking at Quranic schools, is a very different form, looking at recitation practices. Spanish students here at UT. I mean, every context you take is going to have, specific practices and skills that are all tied up in what we call literacy. And that's what has led some researchers to argue for the desirability of not talking about literacy in the singular, but talking about literacies in the plural. Gunther Kress, in his book Literacy in the New Media Age, argues that multimodal and print texts are based on very different logics. He talks about how printed texts are based on a temporal way of thinking and viewing and telling, whereas multimodal texts follow a very spatial process of showing. So instead of telling, you're showing, and that this has effects on how we make sense of things on screen versus how we make sense of things in paper texts. Then Lev Manovich talks about another layer of logic, not just that of showing or telling, but also a layer of the computer itself. And what he argues in his book, Language of New Media, is that modern post-industrial culture has a new logic of individual customization, not mass standardization, and that this is mirrored throughout the structure of new media. So for example, if I start up an account with Yahoo, I can configure the account exactly the way I want it. I can have the particular, the weather for my town or specific things I want to read that show up on my portal, which is sort of my metaphor, my window onto the world of cyberspace. And what Manovich talks about is that these 2 layers, there's the computer layer and the cultural layer, and that this is how we can think of new media. And he says, because new media is created on computers, distributed by computers, and stored and archived on computers, the logic of a computer can be expected to significantly influence the traditional cultural logic of media. That is, we may expect that the computer layer will affect the cultural layer. And so that what he does in his book is lays out different ways that is happening in his view. So with this perspective, we can turn to some of the things that are happening with language in online environments. And I'm going to have just sort of a smattering of different languages here to illustrate a number of principles. One thing that's interesting, I think, is when email was first getting going back in the 80s, in many languages, the only script that you had available was ASCII code. So you had the Roman alphabet, Arabic numerals, and that you had to make do with that. And so in Greek, for example, many people, those who were using email, would write their emails with Roman alphabet. And because if they wanted to participate in the new thing of writing email, that was really the only choice they had available. What's interesting is that when Unicode came along and you were able to have Greek alphabet in your emails, people persisted in using Roman alphabet because that had become the modus operandi of doing email in Greek. It was just now a given that you use Roman. It was just too familiar to now sort of, in a sense, learn over again using Greek alphabet. So this is a message in what's called, Moutsogiannis has this nice article where he talks about using Greeklish, where Greek is written out in Roman alphabet. So here we have the Greek and the Greeklish. This is Greek with Roman transliteration. And he says that oftentimes you'll get messages in both. When you have announcements or something, it'll come out in both. And so the translation of what this is saying is
Dear Mr. Koutsogiannis, your mailbox size has exceeded the 30,000 kilobyte limit. For the best operation of your mailbox, please delete some messages from the mail server. But it goes out in both because people have different practices. And you'll notice that when you have sounds that aren't represented by the Roman alphabet, then there'll be numerals, and we'll see this with Arabic in just a second too. That you have to rely on other symbols to sort of compensate when a given system has a deficiency in terms of your language. So, in Manovich's terms, the computer layer had affected the cultural layer, because now, even though you could write in Greek, the computer had only allowed you to do it with Roman alphabet, and now it's just the way it's done. So it's now part of my culture. So a good example of the computer layer affecting the cultural layer. Another dimension is the use of English in Greek technology. You know, people who are using the internet a lot. A lot of professionals in Greece feel they have to use English increasingly to appear like they're on top of things. And there's a lot of vocabulary that's always coming out with new technological products. And if you're not using English, there's no Greek words for these things. And so if you're going to be really conversant, you have to use English. So that's another aspect of this. And that comes up with Egyptian Arabic as well. Mark Warschauer was working for a USAID project in Cairo for a number of years. And he did a study on the use of Romanized Egyptian Arabic. He found that rarely did people use classical Arabic script to write emails. It was usually a mixture of Arabic and Arabic written with Roman alphabet, and also the Egyptian Arabic, which was also Romanized. So what's interesting here is it's not only a change in alphabet, it's also a change in reading direction. So instead of reading from right to left, you're going from left to right. So we're really looking at a substantial change in people's day-to-day practices. And he found that the more formal the communication had to be, the more likely it was going to be in English. The informal emails were more mixed. Sometimes they were English, sometimes Arabic, sometimes a mix of both. But you know, the idea is that it wasn't just the technology that was encouraging English. It was a whole range of social factors. For example, in the professional world, English is the dominant language in Egypt. Lack of Arabic software standards throughout the Arabic-speaking world. Computer skills were often learned in English rather than in Arabic. A lot of the people in the tech industry had been, and in the education industry or sector, had been educated at least partly in an English-speaking environment and so forth. So you have all these other social factors that are exchanging, that are contributing to language use. It's really a matrix of technological and social and economic, political, cultural factors that are all coming together to influence language use. One of the hypotheses is that, you know, when you've got issues of economy, so time, money, space, that puts constraints on how you use language, and that holds up to a certain extent because you do have use of iconic expressions to save space, especially when you're on a cell phone trying to do an SMS and you've only got a few, you know, room for a few characters. You know, you're obviously going to want to have some abbreviations in there so you can have a complete utterance. Acronyms like LO, are these familiar to everybody? LOL, BRB, Watful, or not? Should I go? Well, LOL is laughing out loud, be right back, rolling on the floor laughing, by the way, frequently asked questions. These are things that are just part of, what's interesting about some of these, I'll come back to LOL in a minute, because LOL has had a huge influence in non-English languages. You find it in Italian, in Portuguese, in French, really, really widespread. It's unbelievable. And I've got a little anecdote I can tell about LOL in just a minute. FAQ is another one that's found in many different languages.
Now, this is frequently asked questions, and there's always like a, an FAQ, button on websites and so forth. Now, you find FAQ. I know I haven't, gone through, dozens of languages or anything, but I know in German, Italian, French, Spanish. I think I'm not sure about Portuguese. I'm not sure, but you'll see FAQ used as a place to go when you have frequently asked questions. Now, this is an abbreviation, but it's English. So, but it's taken on this iconic status. It's just an icon. FAQ means where you go. Now, the French, of course, because they can't tolerate using English acronyms, invented the expression foire aux questions. So that way they could be legit and continue to use FAQ because everyone knew FAQ was the term you wanted to use, but they had to come up with some way of now making it legitimate. So I don't know if other languages have gone that far, but anyway. And then emoticons are another way of making adaptations. So you have different styles across cultures. So here you have, for example, in Japan, you've had the face on the horizontal. Instead of having to turn your head to see what people are saying, you can just look at people straight. And what's nice is that there's a cultural element there. So for example, the girls smile, it's not supposedly polite for girls to have a big toothy grin, but much more of a demure smile. And so the idea is that you don't show a big grin on the icon, but just a demure dot for the mouth, but nevertheless it's taken as a smile. Apparently the most or I don't know, but the most widely used, but very widely used, are these cold sweat and excuse me. The idea is that the semicolon is the sweat coming down the side of your face when you're very embarrassed about something. You're stressed and you're embarrassed. And then the excuse me, this is the arm coming up, scratching behind the head like this, very nervously. So you get these gestural features that are built in to the language. In French, there's a distinction between the regular smiley and this sort of devilish smile for the sarcastic, diabolique kind of humor. Then you have, because the French are always kissing each other on the cheeks, you have to have symbols for that. So you've got this X or the asterisk or the series of X's like we have in English to indicate that. This one here is when the nose is out of joint, but not in the sense of being angry, but rather drunk. So when you go like that, il est trompette, he's sloshed. And then this one with the big D mouth, that can either be laughter or mockery or talking too much, depending on the context. So again, context comes into play in how you interpret these things. In terms of SMS forms, these have sort of influenced all kinds of internet communications. So does anyone want to read this first one? I'm sure there's some adepts in here that can just rattle this off. Right, are you two seeing me later? Now, notice that there are no spaces. We're right back with the ancients here with no spaces between words. Because if you're part of the culture that deals with these kinds of abbreviations, you can read through these no sweat. You don't need to have spaces in between. So again, this is a question of how you're socialized communicatively. Neologism, this word pone, this is comes from a gaming environment, where it's actually interesting because it comes from just the O and the P are right next to each other on the keyboard. And the story, I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but the idea is that sometime someone hit the P instead of the O when they were writing, own. And in the gaming, the context is I own you, meaning I've dominated you in this game, and you have no more resources. I've taken all your resources and so forth. But it became pone with this, frappe, this mistake on the keyboard, which was the P right next to the O, and then that took off as being the legit word rather than own. The pone took on the function because it was just a little bit different, and it allowed everyone to share in this secret knowledge. So it created a sense of community. So by using pone, you knew, if someone used pone, you knew that they were on the inside of the group. So there's an identity feature that's built in to all of this too. Graphic symbols for narrative. So here we have, does anyone know what this would be, what story this would be telling? How do we read this? I mean, if you look at it just as a line of text, it looks like Morse code or something, or Braille. But the idea here is this guy has got a joint hanging out of his mouth. He's inhaling twice, holding his breath, and then letting it out and a smile at the end. So there's a whole bunch of use of these characters in narrative context, and then also, of course, ASCII art, where this is ever since ASCII's been around, you've had people doing all kinds of designs, trying to take this limited set of resources and doing creative things with them. Phonetic spellings and abbreviations in French. Do we have some French? Yeah, Elaine. Carl. Yeah, close. You need to know that TT together is tout. So it's j'ai mal partout. En plus avec le sport d'hier. And then the next one, j'ai une idée pour cet après-midi. Si on allait au ciné, il paraît que le match n'a duré que 12 minutes, vrai? So you get these, weird, so this is saying, I heard everywhere from, doing all those athletics yesterday, those sports. I've got an idea for this afternoon. How about if we go to the movies? It seems like the match lasted only 12 minutes. Is that right? Now, this is an interesting one. When you look at this Q here, because this is internet language. This is hip. You know that the Q is Q. But this is not new. This goes back. This is the same thing was done in 1500 with the Roman de la Rose, where you have, the difference is that you had a macron over the Q. But many of these abbreviations were used in the days of manuscript when you had to have a flush right margin, and so you had to shrink things down or elongate things by adding some letters, depending on because there were no spelling standards, there were no dictionaries, so you shorten or you lengthen in order to get an aesthetic product that has flush margins. So it's ironic, but we're using the same, the things we think of as hip internet language is actually has precursors going way, way back. The use of rebuses like ka, barre, and this one, which is too long to go into right now. But these go back centuries and have been nice parlor games for aesthetic appreciation. Neologisms. I had some students that were in the computer lab. They were doing their chat, and so they signed off saying au revoir, au retaper. Well, au retaper means until we type again. It doesn't exist. I mean, there is no expression au retaper, but they've taken the exact same idea of au revoir, until we see one another again, and transferred that to the context of typing, until we type again. So it's really interesting, the creativity that comes along with this. And this is part of the, this is, the cleverness and the hipness is so important in internet communication. The more clever you are, the higher your status in your group. Back to LOL. I mentioned before that LOL is laughing out loud. There is an expression in French which is MDR, which is mort de rire. That's what you're supposed to say, but a doctoral student in Lyon that I met when I was there had just done a study on internet language, and she found that the use of MDR on a graph, it was like this, and LOL was like this. It was huge, the difference in use. And there was also all these variations, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. There were about 100 variations of there was LOLOL, LOLOL, and with lots of L's, lots of O's, and so forth. And what's interesting is that a student of mine who was teaching in Lille wrote me that he was he was observing these kids on the playground during recess one day, and he was noticing that they would, someone would trip and fall or something, and then say "lol," and they would. So not only were the French kids using it in their internet, writing, but they were actually saying it as well on the playground. So it's had this tremendous influence not only in written language but now also in spoken language. Even though "lol" doesn't mean anything in French, it's just referring to, basically an iconic term in written chat, which is referring to an English term which they don't know even the words that they go back to. And then you can go through different languages, and find this "lol" in various permutations. Italian, this is Portuguese right here. It's very frequently found. Now, to go back to this hypothesis that it's really all about economy, it's really not, because you'll often find cases where things actually are longer. So, for example, moi, which is the standard orthography, is often written as M-O-U-A. So there's an extra character written in. Or bye-bye, which is commonly used in French, written bye-bye. The nice thing about this is that there's sort of an ambiguity. Is it just saying bye-bye? Or, bye is to yawn. So is it sort of a tired, it's the end of the night, bye-bye, I'm yawning, but it's got a literary quality to it. And the thing is that it's taking up actually more space. Quoi, the word quoi, is usually written Q-U-O-I. And it's often abbreviated K-O-A. Well, K-O-A is shorter, but it actually takes longer to type because people usually have automaticity in writing quoi. They can just, it's a normal word. But K-O-A, you have to really think about it. Okay, K, and then O-I. So all these, in terms of processing time, the shortness is not necessarily really an abbreviation. It often takes more time to use the shorter forms. Accents disappearing. When I was working in France, the policy of the office was not to use accents because of this kind of thing where if you don't have if you don't have a compatible interface on both ends, you'll end up with all these garbage characters that end up, here you've got, like 5, 6, 7 characters that get interposed right in the middle of a word, which makes things illegible. So in France, in business context, they'll just say, don't use accents. In German, not using capitals for nouns, contractions influenced by speech. Chinese, lots of phonological approximations. Chinese is an interesting example because, as a lot of you I'm sure know, when you use Chinese, either you type in either the pinyin or the root character that you want to use, and then you go to a table, and then a table appears, and you have to pick the character that you want. Well, all this takes a lot of time in the heat of communication. So oftentimes people will, whenever they can, they'll use numbers that roughly correspond phonologically with the things they're trying to say. So here we have ar, ba, ar for bu, are you hungry? And so 2A2 would be a complete question. And then ar, si, liu for this si, le, starving to death. And then number 8 is ba, so you have ba, ba for bye, bye, being used as a sign-off. And if you look on the internet, you can find strings. Here's just a partial list. You can find hundreds of these things. So if you want to say, you are my only, just type 04551 and it's done. A mixture of numerals and Roman letters. So here we have s, a for sh, a. It's vaguely similar, but it saves a lot of time in the process of writing. And then here for hao, ba, you can replace, just as we saw with the ba, ba, you can replace this character with the 8. The 3Q is interesting. In Chinese, 3 is san. So san Q. Does that sound familiar? So all these innovations, and these become, just part of the culture, and people know how to use these. Subject deletion is very common, so the ni, this is asking where do you come from, and then the ni, the you, is taken out because it's really not necessary. In the use of pinyin with the tones at the end, just spelling things out phonetically is used. It's sort of the standard practice in Singapore, but I'm sure many, many other places as well. So, you know, through all these examples, there's an adaptation to the culture of communication. You know, features of speech from face-to-face speech, the use of emoticons to direct the reader to interpret a message in a certain way. Also, the notion of identity, to create a sense or reaffirm group membership and sharing of practices and values. So if literacy involves familiarity with all these things, with the conventions of texts, how they're arranged and how they're structured, and knowledge of how to use these conventions to understand and produce texts, then what we need to do is to help our students negotiate the interface among all these various logics at play in both multimodal and traditional print texts, and also how to see how these different logics affect meaning. In the case of multimodal texts, literacy involves interpreting the many ways of representing meaning that the new technological tools are making possible. It also involves new forms of critical thinking, focused, for example, on the biases inherent in the structural characteristics of a given medium. So, for example, what Edward Tufte has written about PowerPoint. He's got a great little booklet on PowerPoint, and the very structure of the medium has effects on what happens in communication. And he's very much against the use of PowerPoint, and so it's an interesting read to see how he puts that together. So what we need, in my view, is an approach that focuses on the design of meaning, looking at relationships. What kinds of relationships? Well, relationships between language, cognition, social features, between readers, writers, texts, and cultures, between form and meaning, between spoken and written communication, and the multiple logics in different media. The New London group put together a curricular approach that has 4 components. They talk about situated practice, which is basically immersion in language use, overt instruction, where you need to develop a meta-language, a vocabulary for talking about meaning, critical framing, which is basically reflection on meaning. If we're engaged in communication, that's sort of the situated practice, but the critical framing is looking at it now from a distance, looking at the relationships among elements from the linguistic system, relationships between language use, communicative contexts, and institutional forces, societal forces, and so forth. And then transform practice is looking at how you can sort of redesign texts either within the same medium or across media. So, for example, if you were to write a new written text on the basis of an existing one, or to make a photo essay or a website based on a written text, those would be examples of transformed practice, going along with the critical awareness of the processes involved in that transformation. So how does that all relate to the educational status quo? Basically, the situated practice and overt instruction are widely emphasized in programs, but the critical framing and transformed practice tend to be on the minimized side. So I think that the key thing as we deal with both new media and traditional text is to try and emphasize all 4 of these and how they work together in teaching, rather than just focusing on getting the words out, but also seeing what getting the words out means, both to oneself and to other people. It looks like we're at the end of our time. I won't talk too much about, I just want to show a couple of foreign language teaching projects that take on different aspects of all this. The Penn State Tella Collaboration project has been really important in looking at how language not only is used, but how it's interpreted across cultures. Gilbert Furstenberg's Cultura project, where people respond to questionnaires and exchange interpretations, has been a very important project. What's nice about that is that there's now a sizable archive that even if you don't use Cultura to exchange with another classroom, you can still use the archive to look at the database of responses that both French students and American students, as well as now other languages, Spanish and other languages, are using. Renee Perlmutter, she's a grad student at Berkeley, a couple of years back did a nice blog project where students were given roles to play rather than having to respond from their real lives, real opinions, real pasts. They were given roles to play, and she found that dramatically increased their fluency because they felt too constrained by having to talk about themselves because they really had to do it right and they couldn't fib. But when they were given a role, if they didn't know how to say something, they just say something else and they could just make it up, and that way it worked, and they were able to write a whole lot more by doing that. Digital storytelling, where you tell stories using not just language but also music, sound, image, animation. Glinda Hull at School of Education at Berkeley has done a lot of work with this in the Dusty Lab in Oakland. And Mark Nelson, who's a grad student, he published last year a nice article on digital storytelling, and he's now writing his dissertation on digital storytelling in Japan, where he taught English. So it's really interesting to see how people talk about these processes that they go through as they compose multimedia texts. A project that I'm involved in this year is using desktop video conferencing between students at Berkeley and students in France, where they can see their partners. They work in pairs. Actually, in these photos, for example, these two are not in pairs, but their partners were absent that day. But there's two people in France working with two people in Berkeley, and they can see, gestures, facial expressions, and so forth, as well as the language. And then the idea is to come back and then analyze what was going on during an interaction and talk with the students on both sides about what was happening. So in using technology, the thing that I'd like to argue is that we really ought to be using an approach that focuses on reading and writing practices and how they relate to speaking and listening practices all in one package, and to prepare our students to deal with these new multimodal forms that are involving all these features of language. David Crystal, in his book Language and the Internet, talks about these multimodal forms, something like this. He says, "What I've been calling NetSpeak will become part of a much larger computer-mediated language, which in the digitally designed, enhanced bandwidth environment of the future could be the community's linguistic norm. Whereas at the moment, face-to-face communication ranks as primary. In any account of the linguistic potentialities of humankind, in the future it may not be so. In a statistical sense, we may one day communicate with each other far more via computer mediation than in direct interaction. The effects of what counts as normal language acquisition could be similarly profound." So one thing for sure is that, first of all, reading and writing are more important than ever, and also that, that literacy demands a whole lot more symbolic sophistication and more critical thinking than ever before as well. So literacy is becoming not only multimodal, but also increasingly multilingual. So what we need to do, because language is changing, the culture of literacy is changing, well, that's a given. Languages and cultures are always changing, but in order to deal with these changes, I think we need to focus not just on the latest trend, but looking at the fundamental questions that go back as long as we've had writing, that link technology, language, and cultures of reading and writing over the centuries, and that surface in different guises with each new technology that gets introduced, but nevertheless are grounded in past human experience. So in language teaching, if we can emphasize analysis and thinking in a literacy-based approach, we can help prepare our students not only to use, but also to critically assess new multimodal forms of expression as they continue to evolve. And that's my talk, and we can maybe take a few questions if there's time. Right, right. But that's not to say that you know, I'm not proposing that we all have to be the experts, but that we have to be clued into the practices that our students are familiar with, so that we can relate, for example, what they do on a daily basis to what people have been doing for centuries, so that they can expand the repertoire of communicative practices. I mean, I think that. Yeah, I mean, semiotics is really at the heart of this, because the idea is that you are getting them away from focusing exclusively on language, which often is, I mean, when we use language, that's part of our, I mean, for example, as you and I are talking right now, part of it is language, but it's really only a part. And there's so many other things that we sort of take for granted, but that are crucially important. And so the more we can focus students' attention on all the myriad things that affect how meaning is made and taken, then it's to everyone's benefit. Because, I mean, this is, so often we get ourselves into problems by focusing too much just on, you know, the literal language. What was said, but not taking into account in what context. What were the givens, you know, what were the points of departure, you know, for that utterance that we're going to sort of remove from the layers of context. And when you do that, you might get a completely different, you know, take on what was really, you know, taken as an interpretation or intended, you know, by the producer of the speech or text, whatever. So, I mean, I think that it's really important to look at the network of all of the resources that people have at their disposal and how these resources work together or against one another in producing meaning, and how, you know, traditions will vary from community to community. It's not just a, you know, a national culture thing. It's, you know, within, you know, it's within communities in any culture that, you know, subcultures that will have their own ways of doing things. And there's an in-group and an out-group. And, you know, it's important to try and understand what the rules of discourse production and discourse interpretation are, you know, within those communities, to have some sense, you know, of really what's going on. So I think the more that we can, you know, going back to the overt expression, the more we can develop a vocabulary for talking about all these different things, I think it's a positive thing, because otherwise they remain at the level of the air we breathe. I mean, it's just, it's there and everyone sort of knows about it without thinking about it, but they're not aware of it in the sense of being able to think about it. You know, I would argue that the pedagogy that I'm talking about here would apply beautifully to literature, because, you know, you're looking, I mean, there's so many semiotic dimensions of literature, and the mise en page, you know, how, you know, looking at Apollinaire's poetry, for example, you know, how it's positioned on the page. Where are the spaces? Where is the text? What's the relationship? You know, what's going on spatially here? I mean, so much of that, it's not just the language, it's not the meaning of, you know, looking up the words and then trying to figure out. It's looking at the thing itself and trying to figure out all the relationships that are involved. Some of them are linguistic, other of them are spatial, temporal, etc. You know, so. Yeah, but you know, it's all going to the same lesson. You know, about how the technology. No, but I mean, but well, yeah, in a sense, it's kind of a pedagogical springboard for getting into things that are, you know, more serious. But you know, we're dealing with the same, you know, so many of the same issues about how do you represent yourself to others in a given medium, you know, in the way you want to do it. What are your goals? What are the resources you have available to do that? And then, you know, how do you want to be perceived? And so the idea is to show that in a given community, you know, for a given, you know, intended audience, you're going to have some sort of idea of what's important to get across. And the way you do that effectively is going to have some sense of what are the rules of interpretation, the rules of production are going to be in that environment, so that you can, you know, present an image that you sort of do fit in. The idea is not to get them, you know, so they can write SMS messages in French, but to understand the processes involved. You know, what's lying behind all this. So it's not that they're going to start, you know, writing compositions, you know, with, you know, j'ai une idée pour cet après-midi. Yeah. Yeah, well, because, I mean, in an academic context, what you're interested in is that they present something that is acceptable within an academic, you know, frame of discourse. So the idea is that, you know, we have all these different discourse communities, and there are different rules that pertain to each one. So in this, you know, SMS, you know, we want to send a message to, you know, our best friend or whatever. These are the rules. If we want to look like we belong, we do it this way. In a French literature class, you know that you're going to get kicked out if you do it that way. You can't use those same rules, and that's the important lesson to learn, is that there are distinct sets of rules that will apply in different contexts, and you have to learn not just one set of rules, not two sets of rules, not three sets. You need to learn a whole bunch of different rules to function across many contexts, and that's the real task, is to, you know, introduce students to, you know, really a rich variety of discourses and show how in each context there are different rules of interpretation, different rules of production that apply. And it's being sensitized to that fact, so that they're not, in fact, trying to use the same rules in the most familiar context and applying that blanketly across contexts. That's what you don't want them to do, because they'll fail. You know, if they use an academic discourse in a casual conversation, they will fail. If they're playing on a soccer team and they're trying to, you know, recite poetry, you know, they will fail. You know, if they try to use the soccer team language in the poetry classroom, they will fail. You know, you've got to learn what's appropriate for the given context. So that's, I think the real lesson here is that we can show them a wide variety of contexts and rules of interpretation, and how their job is to negotiate and learn how to learn what the rules are in these different, because you can't teach them everything. You can only give them some examples and show them how they can learn in some context, but then teach them, you know, to learn as they go out and experience new contexts, and because things are changing all the time. Whatever you teach them today won't necessarily hold tomorrow. Yeah. Yeah, it could be, although I know that a lot of students really would be put off by that because it would be too pragmatic and not imaginative enough. I mean, I think a lot of students are drawn to the imaginative that is so highlighted in literature, that there's a real attraction there because of being able to see things in a totally new, through a new imagination. You know, the ways that they couldn't ordinarily imagine things, and being able now to open up their imagination in new ways. So I think, you know, you really need an element of both. You need that mystery and imagination to go along, because, you know, email and websites are so, you know, routine and ordinary. So much of it depends on, you know, knowing who your students are too, and what their predispositions are, and how you can lead them from point A to point B. But you have to start with point A. You have to start where they are. Yeah. Yeah, it's not the thing that you would expect a French person to write. You have to be outside enough to sort of look at it and see, oh, there's a relationship here. I'm going to put, oh, what that be? You know, there's a distance or a remove that's kind of a prerequisite, and I think that is interesting. You get different neologisms. Yeah.
There's something playful about the context.
Yeah.
They're predisposed to playing with language in different ways.
Yeah, but I don't think it's tied to computers necessarily, because if you look at notes that get passed, you know, in the old days when people would, you know, write a little note to their friend and fold it and pass it, you know, in the class, incredible originality and creativity in those notes. You know, again, a real emphasis on cleverness that would be in those brief. So there's something about writing for sure. This interpersonal, immediate writing that goes back and forth. But I don't think it's necessarily tied to the computer per se. Okay, thank you.